The room was quiet like a deep cave, and the lights were soft like a fading sun, and the air smelled clean but cold and strange, and a man lay on a long silver bed, with wires on his arms and a mask on his face, and his body did not move at all, but then his fingers twitched and his eyes opened slowly, and he blinked many times because the light hurt his eyes, and the world felt like a dream. And he did not know where he was or what had happened to him, and he felt lost and scared and weak. Tried to sit up, but his muscles were soft and tired, like they had not moved in years, and his breath was shaky and thin, and his heart beat fast in his chest, and he looked around the room with wide eyes, and saw machines blinking, and screens showing lines and strange symbols he could not read. And then he saw her. She was tall and thin, and her skin was soft blue with tiny silver lines like stars on her arms, and her hair was white and floating like smoke, and her eyes were big and violet, and glowing a little, and she was looking at him with a mix of fear and hope, and her lips moved as she spoke in a soft and careful voice, and said, "You have been asleep for 20 years, human, and now you are finally awake." The man stared at her and tried to speak, but his throat was dry like dust, and he could only whisper one word, and that word was "where?" And the girl came closer, and touched a button on the side of the bed, and warm air flowed into his lungs, and she said, "Please do not be afraid. I am not here to hurt you. I am your guardian. I have waited many years for this moment, and now it is here." He looked into her eyes and asked in a low voice, "Who are you?" And she said, "My name is Sarah, and I am from the planet Chiral, and you are on a ship far from Earth, and I have taken care of you since they brought you here, and I never left your side, and I made a promise to protect you. And now that you are awake, I must tell you something important, and something dangerous." Daniel, that was his name, and it slowly returned to his mind, like light breaking through clouds, and he remembered Earth and green trees, and blue skies, and music, and laughter, and war, and fire, and screams, and running. And then darkness, and now this, and he looked down at his hands and saw they were thin and pale like bones, and his voice was rough, but stronger now, as he asked what happened to Earth, and why am I here? Sarah looked away for a moment, and her hands shook, and she said, "Earth is gone, or at least, what it was is gone. It has changed, and many humans are no longer alive, and there was a war, a long and bloody war, and the council decided humans were too dangerous to live, and they called it the First Purge, and they wiped out most of your kind." Daniel felt cold all over like ice in his chest, and he could not speak, and Sarah touched his arm gently, and said, "You were saved because someone believed in you. Someone high in power said you must not be lost, and so you were kept in sleep, until the time came, and now the time is here, and I was chosen to be your watcher, but I chose to stay and wait, because I believe in you too." He looked at her with tired eyes, and said, "But why? What makes me so special, and what am I supposed to do?" And she opened a small drawer, and took out an old photo, and it showed Daniel standing beside an alien woman with a crown, and behind them, a crowd of both humans and aliens cheering together, and she said, "This is why you once made a promise to my mother, and she was a queen, and she died in the war, but her last words were about you, and she said you were the only one who could stop the second purge." Before Daniel could ask more, a loud alarm sounded through the ship, and the lights turned red, and Sarah's face changed, and she grabbed a long metal rod from the wall, and said, "They know you are awake. We must move now, or they will end what they started 20 years ago, and this time they will not leave you alive." Daniel tried to stand, but his legs shook, and Sarah put her arm around him, and helped him off the bed, and he leaned on her and said, "I do not even know what is real anymore." And she looked at him and said, "Only this is real right now, you and me, and the danger we are in. And we must run, or there will be no more time." She opened the door, and the hallway beyond was dark and narrow and full of strange sounds, and Daniel looked back one last time at the room that had been his prison, and his shelter and his grave for 2 long decades, and then he took a deep breath and stepped into the unknown with the alien girl, who called him important and promised he still had a role to play in a galaxy that had tried to forget his kind. The hallway was quiet, but not peaceful, and each step Daniel took felt like walking through a strange dream, and the walls were smooth, and made of some glowing metal, and strange symbols blinked on panels that he could not read, and the air smelled different, like something to clean and too sharp. And Sarah moved fast beside him, with her long legs and silent steps, and she held the metal rod in her hand, like she had used it before, and her violet eyes watched every corner and shadow, and her soft voice spoke only when needed. She whispered, "Do not stop, and do not ask questions now." And he followed her with weak legs and heavy breath, and his body still felt like it did not belong to him, and his heart beat loud in his ears, and the alarm that had echoed before was gone now. But something worse had replaced it, and that was silence, the kind of silence that hides behind danger. They reached a door, and Sarah tapped a code with her long fingers, and the door slid open with a soft sound, and inside was a small room with blue lights and 2 seats, and a wall of screens, and she closed the door fast, and locked it, and turned to him, and said, "Sit, you need rest, and I will explain now, before they find us again." Daniel sat down slowly, and his hands trembled, and his voice was low as he asked, "Who are they, and why do they want me dead?" And as Sarah did not answer at once, she looked at the screens, and pressed a few buttons, and then finally sat across from him, and her shoulders dropped like she was carrying something heavy, and now she was ready to place it down. She said, "I told you. I was chosen to watch you, but I did not tell you who really chose me, and it was not the council, it was not the ship commander, it was my mother. Before she died, she told me a name, and that name was yours. She said you once saved her life, and you promised to protect the idea of peace between your kind and mine, and she believed in that promise, even when others called her a traitor." Daniel tried to remember, but his mind was still foggy and full of lost time, and as Sarah looked at him, and continued, "I was only a child when she died, and I was sent away, but I held on to her last words, and they led me to this ship, and to you, and I trained to be your watcher, and I passed all tests, and they trusted me, and let me take the role, and I waited all these years for you to wake." He asked, "Why hide the truth, and why lie to me?" And Sarah's voice became softer and almost sad, "Because if I told you everything at once, you would not believe me, and because if others heard what you are and what you were, they would end you before you could move, and some already tried, but I stopped them. I made sure your pod was not tampered with, and I changed the logs and deleted records. And now there is no more time to hide it." Daniel leaned forward, and asked, "What am I then? And what do you mean by the second purge?" And Ray stood and walked to a small panel, and opened it, and pulled out a device, and turned it on, and a hologram lit up in the air between them, showing stars and ships and explosions and fire, and then faces of humans and aliens. Together, then more fire, then silence. She pointed at the faces and said, "Once there was hope, and your kind and mine built something rare and special, but that scared others. The ones who ruled the council feared human spirit and emotion and will and strength. And they saw it as a threat, and so they called it danger, and called it unnatural, and so they began the first purge too. Remove humans from the galaxy." Daniel clenched his fists and said, "And you think there will be a second purge?" And Sarah nodded yes. "Because they are losing control now, and fear is growing, and they say your kind is rising again, and so they want to end it before it starts, and they think killing you will stop the spark, but I think they are wrong, and I think you still carry the fire inside you." He looked at the glowing faces in the hologram, and one of them was his own, younger and full of life and hope, and he asked, "What did I say back then that made your mother believe in me?" And Sarah said, "She never told me, but I think it was not words, it was how you looked at her, like she was not just an alien or an enemy, but someone who mattered, and that was rare." Suddenly, the screen blinked red, and a warning flashed, and Sarah's eyes went wide, and she said, "They are scanning this section. We have to move again," and she grabbed his arm and helped him up, and Daniel stood taller now, his body still weak, but his mind was waking up like a fire that had been cold for years, but now found air. As they left the room, and ran down another corridor, Daniel looked at his Sarah, and asked one last thing before the next door opened. "Why do you still believe in me?" And she looked at him with something warm in her eyes, and said, "Because you believed in us, when no one else did, and that is a truth worth saving." The sky above the planet was red like fire trapped in clouds, and below the mountains stood tall and sharp, like blades rising from the dust, and the air was dry and hot, and full of strange sounds, and Daniel stood on a rocky hill with Sarah beside him, and both of them were silent, as the wind moved around them like a warning, and the stolen pod they had escaped in now burned behind them in pieces. They had landed hard, and survived by luck or fate, or something else, and Sarah's arm was hurt and bleeding blue, and Daniel had carried her part of the way until they found the cave, and now they stood and looked out over a wide desert with ruins far below, and the wind carried voices, but not human ones, and Daniel felt like something watched them from the shadows. Even if nothing moved, he turned to Sarah and asked, "What is this place?" And she said, "It is a planet the council forgot, or maybe they wanted to forget it. It was a place used during the first purge, a prison world where humans and those who helped them were sent to vanish and die, but some lived, and now they hide here with stories and pain and broken hope." Daniel asked how many are here, and she said, "Not many, and most are old or sick or afraid, and they do not trust strangers. Not even me, because I come from a ship, and a name they fear, and they know the second purge is close, and they believe no one will stop it this time." They walked down the rocky path, slow and careful, and Sarah limped, but did not ask for help, and Daniel watched her, and saw her strength and her fear and her silence, and he wondered how long she had carried this alone, and why she never ran away from it. At the edge of the ruins, a figure stepped out, and it was not alien, and it was not young, And it was not kind, and his eyes were sharp, and his face was lined with time and pain, and he pointed a long weapon at Daniel, and said in a dry voice, "You are human, and that means trouble, and maybe death." Daniel raised his hands and said, "I do not come to fight, I only want to speak." And the man looked at Sarah and said, "And you brought him here? Why?" And she said, "Because he is not like the others. And he is not part of what is coming, he is part of what could stop it." The man stared at Daniel, and then slowly lowered the weapon, and said, "Follow me. If you lie, we will know, and if you try to lead them here, you will die." And Daniel nodded, and said, "I understand." They walked through broken buildings, made of old metal and stone, and the walls were marked with names and dates and lost hopes, and in a large hall lit by weak fires, the man stopped and pointed at the wall and said, "Look." And Daniel saw a list, and his name was there. Not once but 3 times he asked why and how, and the man said, "Because you were part of something once. You spoke to our people, and gave them hope, and you led a mission that saved a ship full of children, and you tried to stop the war with words, not with fire. And that was before the first purge burned everything, and now they fear you again, because a name can be powerful even when the body sleeps." Sarah stepped forward and said, "He remembers pieces, and more will return, but he needs to see the truth now, or nothing will matter." And the man looked at her and then said, "Follow me again." And he took them to a deep room with a screen and a device. And he said, "This holds the memory of the first days of the purge, and it was hidden from the council. And now you must see." Daniel sat down, and the screen lit up and showed Earth from space and ships moving fast, and then explosions and screams and fire and people crying and running, and the council speaking lies to the stars and saying humans had attacked first and that they were too wild to trust. And then the screen showed something else. It showed Daniel standing in a room with leaders, both human and alien, and he was young and his voice was strong, and he said, "We can still fix this. We do not need war. We need to see each other and speak and listen and forgive and protect the future, not erase the past." Then the image froze, and the man said, "That was the last message you sent before they silenced it and shut down the link, and you vanished, and they told us you were dead, but some believed you were hidden, and now here you are, and the spark is lit again, but you must decide if you will carry it or run." Daniel looked at Sarah and saw her watching him, not with fear but with hope, and he felt the weight of her promise and her pain, and he knew that his name still lived in quiet places and still meant something to those who had nothing left. He stood and said, "Then we stop the second purge, not with war, but with truth, and with voices they cannot silence, and with the fire they could not kill in me or in them." And Sarah smiled for the first time and whispered, "Then we begin." The stars outside the small window did not blink, and they did not move. They just stared back, like cold eyes, watching from the dark, and inside the ship everything was quiet again, too quiet, like a trap had been set, and now it waited, and Sarah pressed her back to the metal wall, with Daniel beside her, and the hallway in front of them was narrow and long, with red lights pulsing like a warning. In every corner, Daniel held the tool Sarah gave him, not a weapon, but sharp and heavy, and he had never used anything like it before, but his hands were steady now, not from strength but from something deeper, a feeling that said this moment mattered. And that fear would only make it worse. And Sarah leaned close and whispered, "The patrol just passed. We have 2 minutes. Maybe less. We go to deck 7, then down the vent shaft. If we make it there, they will not find us again." He nodded once, and followed as she moved, quick and silent, and her body still moved like a shadow, even with her wound, and the sound of their steps was covered by the hum of machines and the soft beep of the ship's heart, and they passed rooms with locked doors and flashing signs, and Daniel saw glimpses of strange labs with things floating in tanks, things that were not human and not alien, and he looked away. They reached the lift, but it was locked, and Sarah pulled open a panel and cut 2 wires and pressed them together, and the door slid open with a soft groan, and they stepped inside. And the floor shook as the lift moved down, and the silence felt louder, now like something in the ship knew they were not where they should be. Daniel asked, "Why is deck 7 the way out?" And Sarah said, "It is where the lower escape shafts connect, and where old cargo pods are stored, and the council guards do not go there often, because it smells like rot, and they fear disease, and failure, and ghosts." And Daniel almost smiled, but then the lift stopped, and the door opened, and 2 guards stood waiting. Sarah did not speak. She moved like a flash, and her rod hit the first guard before he could lift his arm, and he dropped with a thud, and Daniel did not wait. He swung the tool and caught the second guard's hand, and the weapon fell, and Sarah finished the rest, and silence returned, but now it was full of blood and breath. They dragged the bodies behind crates, and Daniel's chest burned, but he kept moving, and Sarah wiped her blade and said, "We are close now, only 1 vent left, and then we drop, and after that the old pod should still be there if no one found it." And they walked again, this time faster, because time was running out, and the lights above started to blink in warning patterns. They found the vent and Sarah climbed first, even with her wound, and Daniel followed, and the shaft was tight and hot and smelled like old metal and oil and fire, and the path was long and twisted, and once Daniel almost slipped, but Sarah caught his arm and pulled, and they kept going until they reached the grate, and Sarah kicked it out and jumped down. Daniel followed and landed hard but safe. The room they entered was dark and full of old metal and dust and forgotten things, and Sarah limped to the far wall and pulled off a cover, and inside was a pod, small and scratched, but whole, and she touched it like it was an old friend and said, "This one was used by smugglers and banned from the system, but I found it and fixed it over many years. While you slept." Daniel helped her into the pod and climbed in beside her, and she pressed buttons, and lights blinked, and the engine groaned like a sleeping beast, and then woke, and Sarah smiled a little, and said, "Hold on," and the door opened with a hiss, and they launched into space like a shot, and the stars spun around them. Behind them alarms screamed, and the ship grew smaller and smaller, and Daniel watched it disappear, and asked how long before they follow, and Sarah said, "Not long, but this pod is fast, and I blocked the tracker, and with luck we reach the desert moon before they catch us, and if we land near the ruins, we have a chance." Daniel looked at her and said, "You planned all this, even before I woke up?" And she said, "Yes, because I knew they would try to end you, and I could not let that happen, not after what my mother told me, not after what I saw in the records, and not after what I began to believe." The pod shook as they entered the pull of the desert moon, and flames licked the sides, and the heat made Daniel sweat, and the ground came fast and rough, and they hit with a crash, and silence followed, but they were alive, and that was enough. Sarah coughed and opened the door, and dust filled the air, and outside was red sand and broken stone and a sun that did not smile, and she said, "Welcome to the place where they threw away the truth, and where we begin again." And Daniel stepped out with her, and said, "Then let us find the ones they forgot, and remind them what still lives." The sky above the desert was wide and empty, and the heat came not just from the sun but from the ground itself, like the planet wanted to burn away anyone who stepped on it. And Daniel walked beside a scepter across red sand and sharp rocks, and the wrecked pod behind them looked small now, like a broken shell left by some creature that had crawled away to survive. The air tasted dry and full of dust, and the wind carried old sounds like voices that had no body, and Daniel kept looking around with careful eyes, because the silence here did not feel like peace. It felt like something waiting and watching, and Sarah's steps were slow and heavy now, because her wound had opened again, and blue blood marked the sand behind her. Daniel offered to carry her, but she said no with a tired smile, and pointed toward a line of jagged stones in the distance, and said, "We are close. They will see us soon if they are still there, and if they still care." And Daniel asked, "Who are they?" And Sarah said, "The forgotten, the hunted, the broken ones who still remember what the galaxy wants to erase." They walked for what felt like hours under the burning sky, and then the rocks rose high like a wall, and a voice called from the shadows and said, "Stop now, or be stopped." And Daniel froze, and Sarah raised a hand and said, "We are not enemies. We come with truth, not lies." And the voice laughed and said, "All truth dies out here, but come if you want and see what is left of those who once believed." They stepped through a narrow path between the stones, and entered a place hidden from the sky, a small camp made of scrap metal and cloth and stone, and the people who lived there were not all the same. Some had scales and horns and glowing eyes, and some looked more like Daniel but with hard faces and scarred skin, and none of them smiled. An old woman with silver skin and blind eyes stepped forward and touched Sarah's cheek, and said, "I know this shape, I know this voice. You carry the blood of Chiral, and your mother was brave and foolish and kind, and she died for a dream that burned, and now you come with a human by your side. Do you bring fire again, or water?" Sarah bowed her head, and said, "I bring both if he chooses to rise." And the woman turned to Daniel, and placed her cold fingers on his face, and said, "You are him, the sleeper, the echo, the name that still rings through broken walls." And Daniel said, "I do not know who I was, but I want to know who I must become." They led them to a tent made of thick cloth and metal sheets, and inside were maps and weapons, and old data screens, and around a table sat four others. One was human with a metal arm, and one was tall and thin with wings that did not fly, and one was covered in fur and smelled like smoke, and one was young with glowing eyes, and fire on her skin, and none of them looked pleased. The human said, "We do not need another ghost," and the one with wings said, "Names do not win battles," and the one with fire said, "I remember the last time hope walked in, and it left us with graves and silence." And Daniel listened to all of it, then stood straight and said, "I do not promise to fix what is broken, I only ask for a chance to try." Sarah stepped beside him, and placed a small cube on the table, and said, "This is why we came." And the cube lit up, and showed the old message again, the one where Daniel stood before leaders, and called for peace, and the room went still, and even the fire girl stopped moving, and the metal-armed man looked away. The old woman entered and said, "I remember that voice. It gave us strength once, and now the council hunts again, and they bring the second purge. Not with bombs, but with silence and fear, and poison, and if we wait, we will vanish like smoke. So the question is, will the voice rise again, or will it fade?" Daniel looked at each of them, and then at Asera, and then at his own hands, and said, "I may not be the same man, but I carry the same fire, and I will speak even if no one listens. And I will stand even if I stand alone, because silence has taken too much, and it will take no more." The room stayed silent for a long breath, and then the fire girl stepped forward, and said, "Then let us burn." And the winged one nodded, and said, "Then let us fly." And the man with the metal arm lifted a blade and said, "Then let us fight." And the young one with glowing eyes smiled for the first time, and said, "Then let us hope." Outside the tent, the camp began to move. People gathered, and plans were made and weapons cleaned and signals sent. And in the center stood Daniel, with the wind on his face and Asera at his side, and he felt not like a ghost or a sleeper or a name, but like something real, like a flame catching the edge of dry grass. And far above the planet in the cold black of space, a council ship changed direction, and began to fall toward the desert moon, with its guns ready, and its eyes wide open. The cave was deep and cold, and full of silence, and the air smelled like dust and old stories, and Daniel stood in the center with Asera behind him, while firelight danced across the walls, and strange shapes moved in the shadows, like echoes of another time. And the elder woman with silver skin pointed to a stone arch covered in markings, and said, "Your answers are there, if you still wish to see who you were before the sleep." Daniel stepped forward slowly, and touched the stone, and the surface warmed beneath his hand, and the markings began to glow like stars, and a soft hum filled the air. And Asera took a step closer, but did not speak, and Daniel closed his eyes, and let the light pull him in. In his mind the cave vanished, and a city rose around him, made of tall towers and clear glass, and airships moving across the sky, and people walked below with faces full of wonder and peace. And at the center stood a hall where voices echoed and names were spoken, and banners flew from both human and alien homes. And he saw himself there, standing proud with others. Beside him he saw a woman with dark red eyes and a crown of silver, and she placed her hand on his shoulder, and said, "You carry the bridge between worlds, and your voice brings calm to storm, and your heart holds the strength of both fire and water. And the path ahead will burn, but you will walk it still, and you must promise me you will not forget us." He saw battlefields and fire, and broken ships falling from the sky, and he saw himself carrying a child through smoke, and shouting for peace into a camera that no longer worked. And then he saw shadows darker than space, and the councilmen with eyes like stone, and mouths full of lies, and hands that erased whole cities. And he saw Asera, small and afraid, watching from behind her mother's throne. The vision faded, and the cave returned, and the glow on the stone faded with it. And Daniel fell to one knee, with breath shaking in his chest, and Asera reached out to hold him, and said, "What did you see?" And he looked into her eyes and said, "I saw what I was, and I saw the fire and the fall, and I remember now the promise I made and why they fear me." Asera helped him stand, and the elder nodded slow, and said, "Then you are ready now, because memory is not just pain, it is power and truth. And those who remember cannot be controlled, and now the ones above are coming to silence you again, but this time you are not alone." Daniel walked back into the light with new steps, and the camp gathered around him, and the fire girl placed a mark on his arm and said, "Now you burn with us." And the man with the metal arm handed him a blade and said, "Now you fight with us." And the winged one gave him a device with old codes and said, "Now you fly with us." Together they moved across the dry land, and climbed high rocks, and set traps and signals, and watched the sky. And at night Daniel looked up at the stars, and wondered how many still remembered Earth, and how many still believed a human voice could matter. And Asera sat beside him, and said, "You gave them hope again without asking for it, and that is why they follow you." In the morning the ship appeared in the sky, long and black with lights like angry eyes, and it hovered above the rocks, and then smaller ships dropped like knives toward the ground. And Daniel raised his hand and said, "Now we speak, not with hate, but with truth, and not to beg, but to be heard. And if they silence us, let the stars remember our fire." They stood in a wide circle with Daniel at the center, and Asera beside him and the others around them. And the council's soldiers came in silver armor, with long rifles and hard eyes, and they marched without words until they stopped just a few feet away, and a tall figure stepped forward with a voice that sounded like metal and ice, and said, "Surrender the human, and no more lives will be taken." Daniel stepped forward and said, "I am not here to run, and I am not here to bow, and I do not come with weapons. I come with memory and voice, and I come with the truth that you tried to bury, but it lives and breathes and stands before you. And if you silence me today, more voices will rise tomorrow, and your fear will never be enough to stop them all." The council figure raised his hand, but did not speak, and the ground trembled, not with war, but with something deeper, something like a shift in time and space. And Daniel looked up at the sky and whispered, "I remember, and I will not sleep again." The ground beneath Daniel's feet was hot and cracked, and the wind carried dust and tension across the wide open plain where the exiles stood with him shoulder to shoulder, and blade to claw to wing, and their eyes were not afraid anymore. Their eyes were ready and bright, with something older than fear and stronger than science. The council ship hovered like a god above them, cold and still, with no mercy in its design, and no warmth in its shadow, and behind the silver line of soldiers the council envoy stood tall in his polished armor with golden trim, and his voice rang through the air like a command from the stars as he spoke one last time and said, "Human, you will kneel or vanish, and your name will end." Here Daniel did not move, and his eyes locked with the envoy's, and his voice was low but firm as he said, "I will kneel only if the stars kneel with me. I will vanish only if every voice in this galaxy forgets how to speak, and I will fall only if the fire inside me dies. And I promise you, it never will." He stepped forward, not with a weapon, but with a banner made from old cloth, and stitched symbols and burned corners, and every thread told a story of war and loss, and love and hope, and he raised it high in the wind, so that every camera and drone above could see it, and the people watching in secret corners of space could see it and remember what was buried. As Syrah moved beside him, and placed her hand on the banner and said, "This is the flag of what could have been, and what still can be, and if they try to erase it again, then they will have to erase all of us together." And her voice was calm like water, but her eyes burned like stars. The fire girl stepped forward and lit her own arm with flame, and held it to the sky and said, "Let them see us not as ghosts, but as fire that walks." And the winged one spread his broken wings wide, and shouted, "Let them see. The sky still holds creatures they cannot control." And the metal-armed man slammed his fist into the ground and said, "Let them see. The old warriors still stand." The soldiers raised their rifles, and the sound of charging weapons filled the air, and Daniel raised his free hand and said, "Wait just one moment more." And from the rocks behind the camp, more exiles appeared, old and young, sick and strong, each carrying pieces of old armor and broken tools and strange flags, and they came in silence, but their eyes spoke loudly. One by one they stood beside Daniel and Asera, and formed a circle of living memory around them, and together they looked up at the ship, and the ship saw them, and the council saw them, and somewhere beyond the stars, others watching through forbidden channels and broken signals saw them too, and they felt something they had not felt in years. They felt the truth. Then the ship moved slowly back, and the envoy gave no order, and the soldiers looked at one another, and some lowered their weapons, and some turned and walked away, and the silence grew louder, until it was not silenced at all, but something holy, something real. Daniel took a long breath and stepped forward again, and his voice echoed across the rocks as he said, "We are not your enemy, we are not your tools, we are not your fear, and we are not gone, we are here. We are many, and we are ready to speak, and to live, and to build if we must, and your time of silence is done." A signal crackled in the sky, and then a voice came from the ship's loudspeakers, but this time it was not cold, it was not the envoy, it was another voice, softer, older, tired, and it said, "Let him speak, and let the galaxy decide." And the ship turned, and rose, and left. Without a shot, without a threat, without a word more, the people on the ground stood quiet as the ship vanished. And Daniel lowered the banner and turned to Asera, who was already smiling, and the fire girl laughed and threw her flame into the air. And the others shouted and cheered, and sang songs that had no melody, but full hearts. Daniel walked to the edge of the cliff where he could see the desert stretch into forever, and he placed the old banner in the sand, and let it stand alone, as a new wind lifted it higher, and he said softly, "Let this be the last place where names were buried, and the first place where truth stood." Talasera came to his side and whispered, "You did not lead them with power or fire or force. You led them with memory and hope, and that is why you were never truly asleep, and why your name was never truly forgotten." And Daniel turned to her and said, "Then let us not be forgotten again." And so they began again, not with a war, but with words, and not with weapons, but with stories, and not in fire, but in light. And the galaxy that once feared his voice now listened, and the stars above seemed to shine just a little closer, just a little warmer, and just a little brighter than before.